The first encounters between U.S. Marines and Japanese infantry did not unfold at a distance. They erupted at arm's length, inside jungle clearings, along coral ridges, and in the suffocating darkness between palm trunks. Rifles cracked so close that muzzle flashes burned into memory. Grenades were thrown not toward coordinates, but toward sounds, breathing, footsteps, whispered orders. This was not industrial war as either side had imagined it. It was intimate, personal, and immediately unforgiving. Japanese soldiers entered these fights with a settled assumption. American troops, they believed, came from a society unused to hardship and allergic to sacrifice. Shock, speed, and aggression would shatter them. A sudden charge, a scream in the dark, a bayonet appearing where none should be. This doctrine had worked before, against opponents who valued survival over position. It was expected to work again. The Marines, meanwhile, discovered something equally jarring. The enemy in front of them did not retreat when wounded, did not surrender when isolated, did not break when surrounded. Japanese soldiers fought forward until their bodies failed, guided by an indoctrination that placed death above capture and endurance above reason. For Marines raised on field manuals and marksmanship tables, this was not just bravery, it was an entirely different relationship with mortality. The first firefights ended without clarity. Positions were taken, then contested again. Attacks succeeded tactically, yet failed psychologically. Marines held ground they expected to lose. Japanese units absorbed casualties they had assumed would end resistance. Each side withdrew at nightfall unsettled, carrying a quiet realization back to their lines. The enemy did not behave as predicted. In early Japanese after-action reports, a phrase began to surface, not emphasized, not explained, but noted with restraint. The Marines do not yield. It was not yet fear, it was confusion. Doctrine had promised collapse, experience delivered resistance. By the end of those initial clashes, the myth of easy victory lay damaged on both sides of the battlefield. The Japanese had not broken American morale. The Marines had not shattered Japanese resolve. What remained was a more troubling question, unspoken, but already shaping the war to come. In a campaign measured not just in casualties, but in conviction, which side could endure longer, not merely the violence of battle, but the slow erosion of belief itself. The resilience Japanese soldiers encountered did not emerge spontaneously on the battlefield. It had been cultivated deliberately, long before the first landing craft cut through Pacific surf. In the years between wars, the U.S. Marine Corps remained small, underfunded, and often overlooked, a condition that hardened rather than diluted its identity. Training emphasized deprivation. Discipline was enforced not to impress, but to endure. The Corps learned to survive with little, because little was often all it had. At the center of this culture stood the rifle. Marine marksmanship was not taught as a skill to be recalled under pressure, but as a reflex to be relied upon when pressure erased thought entirely. Every Marine, regardless of rank, was trained to shoot accurately, repeatedly, and independently. Fire discipline was drilled until it became instinct. Small unit leadership was cultivated early, empowering corporals and sergeants to make decisions in isolation, because isolation was expected. This ethos shaped Marines who did not depend on momentum or spectacle. They were conditioned for delay, for attrition, for holding ground under conditions where reinforcement might not come. Hardship was not framed as a temporary trial, but as the natural state of combat. Hunger, fatigue, and fear were acknowledged, then set aside. What mattered was function, remaining effective when comfort disappeared. Japanese intelligence, observing America from a distance, saw none of this. Reports characterized U.S. forces as mechanized, indulgent, reliant on technology rather than will. The Marine Corps, when mentioned at all, was often conflated with the broader American military, assumed to share the same vulnerabilities. It was a judgment rooted in cultural projection rather than evidence. That misreading carried consequences. Shock tactics were planned against an enemy expected to recoil. Psychological pressure was designed for soldiers believed to value survival above duty, but the Marines arriving in the Pacific were not strangers to endurance. They carried with them an institutional memory of hardship, reinforced by doctrine and habit. As transports gathered and maps were unrolled, neither side fully understood the nature of the test ahead. But on one island in particular, the assumptions of years would be measured in blood and exhaustion. Guadalcanal waited, silent, unforgiving, and ready to reveal which beliefs could survive first contact with reality. Imperial Japo. Ni's army doctrine entered the Pacific War carrying conclusions already settled. American soldiers, it taught, were products of comfort, men shaped by abundance, distracted by machinery, and softened by civilian life. They would fight well when supported, but falter when isolated. Remove certainty, apply pressure, and their resolve would fracture. This belief was not debated, it was inherited. Bushido reinforced the assumption. Japanese soldiers were trained to see endurance and self-sacrifice as moral absolutes, qualities presumed rare in Western armies. Against such an ethic, the enemy was expected to recoil when confronted with unwavering aggression. Fear, it was believed, could be manufactured quickly. Victory would follow shock, not endurance. From this worldview emerged a preferred method of battle. Night attacks would unravel cohesion. Infiltration would confuse command. Sudden violence would disorient units dependent on structure and supply. These tactics had proven effective against forces unwilling to absorb sustained psychological stress. Japanese planners saw no reason they would fail now. Within forward units, confidence hardened into certainty. Psychological dominance was assumed before the first shot was fired. The enemy would withdraw once the cost became apparent. Resistance, if encountered, would be temporary. The campaign was framed not as a test of wills, but as an exercise in execution. What was absent from these calculations was the possibility of equivalence. There was no preparation for an opponent who could endure shock without losing cohesion. No framework for confronting soldiers who met aggression with discipline rather than panic. Japanese doctrine anticipated fear as a weapon. It did not account for an enemy already accustomed to it. This misreading was subtle but decisive. It shaped plans, timings, and expectations. It determined how attacks were launched and how success was measured. When resistance did not collapse as predicted, the discrepancy was initially attributed to circumstance rather than assumption. But circumstance would repeat itself. The stage was set not for a swift psychological victory, but for a reckoning. When American Marines went ashore on a remote island in the southern Solomons, the Imperial Army believed it understood its enemy. What it did not yet grasp was that every premise guiding its strategy was about to be tested, simultaneously, violently, and without mercy. As the first landing craft approached Guadalcanal, doctrine met reality, and the war, at last, truly began. Guadalcanal did not announce itself as a proving ground. It was an airstrip carved from jungle, ringed by swamps and ridgelines barely known beyond naval charts. Yet once the Marines dug in, it became the first place where Japanese doctrine was tested against an enemy that refused to behave as predicted. The confrontation began after sunset, when Japanese units moved as they always had, silently, confidently, expecting collapse. Night assaults came in waves. Screams pierced the darkness. Flares burst overhead, casting brief, violent clarity across firing lines. But instead of confusion, the Marines responded with order. Fields of fire were pre-registered. Rifles cracked in controlled rhythm. Machine guns did not spray blindly, they searched and fixed. Attacks meant to shatter cohesion instead revealed it. The Marines held under conditions that should have undone them. Malaria hollowed bodies, hunger sharpened tempers. Rain turned foxholes into grave of mud and water. Sleep came in fragments measured by artillery intervals, yet positions remained occupied. Lines bent but did not break. Even as units rotated, discipline held, carried not by comfort but by habit. Japanese officers watching these engagements struggled to reconcile expectation with reality. Assaults that should have opened gaps ended in piles of dead. Units that should have withdrawn fought on until ammunition was gone. The Marines did not retreat when pressed, they adjusted. Fire shifted. Reserves moved. Counterattacks came not with fury, but with precision. In this crucible, something new took shape. Defensive doctrine evolved in real time, overlapping fire zones, integrated machine gun nests, and decentralized control that allowed junior leaders to react without waiting for orders. What had been training theory became battlefield practice. Guadalcanal turned experience into system. Fear began to emerge, but not in the way Japanese planners had imagined. It was not inspired by cruelty or spectacle. It grew from endurance, from the realization that these Americans could absorb pressure indefinitely without unraveling. That night after night, the same lines reappeared, occupied by the same quiet resolve. Reports changed tone. Confidence gave way to caution. The enemy was no longer dismissed as soft or hesitant. He was described as stubborn, methodical, unyielding. The first cracks in certainty widened into doubt. Guadalcanal did not end the illusion in a single moment. It eroded it, attack by attack, night by night. And as the battle stretched across the Solomons, the lesson would not remain confined to one island. It would travel, carried by survivors, recorded in reports, and waiting to be relearned wherever Marines came ashore next. The Pacific did not allow stagnation. Every island imposed its own demands: dense jungle that swallowed formations, ridgelines that distorted sound, humidity that rusted weapons overnight. Tactics carried ashore from training fields proved insufficient within days. The Marines learned quickly or paid for it immediately. What emerged was not a single innovation, but a habit of constant adjustment. In this environment, small units became decisive. Fire teams learned to move and fight independently, navigating terrain where visibility rarely extended beyond a few yards. Squad leaders and non-commissioned officers assumed authority by necessity, making decisions without guidance from higher command. The Marine Corps' emphasis on decentralized control transformed confusion into flexibility. When contact came suddenly, response followed just as fast. As campaigns progressed, coordination deepened. Infantry learned to work seamlessly with artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support. Radios became lifelines. Timing replaced brute force. Each landing refined the integration of arms, reducing reliance on mass and increasing precision. The battlefield became a system, not a sequence of isolated actions. Japanese troops observed this change with growing unease. The enemy they faced on later islands was not the same force encountered earlier. Tactics that once created disruption now met immediate countermeasures. Infiltration routes were anticipated. Ambushes triggered overlapping fires. The Marines did not simply endure, they learned and they remembered. This capacity to improve continuously altered the balance of psychological pressure. Japanese commanders understood attrition. They did not expect acceleration. Losses were assumed to weaken resistance. Instead, resistance sharpened. Each engagement seemed to produce a more capable opponent. Adaptation, rather than firepower alone, became the Marines' defining advantage. Japanese responses intensified. Attacks grew more desperate. Charges were launched with greater urgency, as if speed might reclaim the initiative. But escalation could not reverse comprehension. The Marines had turned experience into doctrine and doctrine into instinct. What unsettled Japanese soldiers most was not the Americans' numbers or equipment. It was the realization that they were facing an opponent who treated war as a problem to be solved, not a ritual to be endured. Every mistake became instruction. Every setback became rehearsal. And soon another element began to stand out, something quieter, more personal, and far more unsettling. As engagements multiplied, Japanese units started to notice that Marines did not just move and adapt efficiently. They shot with a precision that felt deliberate and increasingly impossible to escape. As the campaigns stretched across the Solomons, a new pattern began to surface in Japanese reports. Casualties were no longer attributed solely to firepower or surprise, but to accuracy. Marines were not expending ammunition wildly. Shots arrived measured, deliberate, and often fatal. Engagements ended quickly, not because resistance vanished, but because exposure became instantly punished. What unsettled Japanese troops most was that this precision persisted under conditions where it should have failed. In night fighting, where visibility collapsed into shadow and sound, Marines continued to hit what they aimed at. Flares illuminated brief moments of clarity, and in those moments, fire found its mark. Movement drew bullets. Hesitation proved lethal. Darkness, once an ally, lost its protection. Automatic weapons amplified this effect. Browning automatic rifles and machine guns were employed not as instruments of volume, but of control. Bursts were short, fields of fire were calculated. Crossing open ground, even for seconds, became an act of near-certain exposure. These weapons did more than kill, they shaped behavior, compressing movement and constraining initiative. Japanese doctrine emphasized massed aggression. Volley fire and coordinated charges were designed to overwhelm through momentum. Against marine positions, those methods disintegrated. Individuals advancing as part of a wave were identified, tracked, and stopped. What had been collective became singular. Survival depended not on courage alone, but on invisibility, and invisibility was increasingly rare. In after-action reflections, Japanese officers reached for new language. The enemy was no longer described as reactive or stubborn. He was watching. Marines were likened to hunters, patient, disciplined, and lethal when opportunity appeared. The metaphor carried weight. Hunters did not rush. They waited, they chose. This shift marked a deeper psychological break. Fear was no longer momentary or situational. It became anticipatory. Every movement invited calculation. Every sound raised suspicion. The battlefield narrowed, not from terrain, but from expectation. Yet even this realization did not fully prepare them for what lay ahead. Precision and discipline, sharpened across months of fighting, were about to be tested in a place where concealment disappeared and exposure was unavoidable. Ahead lay an island barely large enough to retreat on, where landing craft would stall in open water and fire would come from every direction. Its name was Tarawa, and there Japanese doubt would harden into certainty. Tarawa was small enough to be crossed on foot in an afternoon, yet it absorbed violence on a scale that defied its size. When the first waves of Marines moved toward Batio Island in November 1943, they did so in full view of prepared defenses. Tides failed. Landing craft grounded hundreds of yards offshore. Men stepped into water chest-deep under direct fire. There was no concealment, no maneuver, only forward motion measured in yards and lives. Machine guns and artillery tore into the advancing lines. Units disintegrated before reaching the beach. Bodies marked paths through coral and surf. Casualties mounted so rapidly that even seasoned observers struggled to comprehend the pace of loss. Yet the movement did not stop. Survivors pressed on individually, then reformed into fragments of squads, then advanced again. What should have been a shattered assault became a sequence of relentless renewals. For Japanese defenders, the shock was immediate. The landing itself was expected to annihilate resistance. Instead, Marines appeared where none should have survived. Positions thought secure were engaged from angles that defied planning. Bunkers fell not to overwhelming numbers, but to persistence. Flamethrowers brought forward under fire, demolition charges placed at point-blank range, riflemen covering engineers as if by instinct. The fighting collapsed into inches. Inside trenches and concrete emplacements, combat became personal and unforgettable. Grenades detonated in enclosed spaces. Rifles fired until barrels burned. The air carried dust, smoke, and the constant percussion of impact. For both sides, Tarawa etched itself into memory not as a battle, but as a sensation, pressure without release. Amid this chaos, Marine coordination did not vanish. It adapted. Units with no officers still advanced. Runners replaced radios. Machine gun teams repositioned under fire without orders. Artillery support was adjusted by men crawling forward to observe targets. Control survived not because conditions allowed it, but because discipline made it unavoidable. Japanese defenders were stunned by how quickly positions fell once Marines reached the island proper. Strongpoints designed to hold for days were reduced in hours. Resistance continued fiercely, but the tempo shifted. The Marines dictated momentum, forcing defenders into reaction rather than execution. Defensive doctrine collapsed under the weight of sustained assault. For those who survived, the psychological impact endured far beyond the battle. Japanese soldiers later described the Americans not as reckless, but as unafraid, men who advanced knowing the cost and accepting it without pause. The distinction mattered. Fearlessness implied chaos. This was something else, resolve applied deliberately. By the third day, organized Japanese resistance was effectively ended. Nearly the entire garrison lay dead. Marine losses were severe, over 1,000 killed and thousands more wounded in 76 hours. Victory came without celebration. It arrived exhausted, quiet, and irrevocable. Tarawa rewired perception. What had been doubt hardened into understanding. The Marines were no longer misjudged adversaries or temporary anomalies. They were a force capable of absorbing catastrophic loss without surrendering cohesion. For Japanese command, the lesson was brutal and unmistakable. The Americans did not fear death in the way doctrine had predicted. They moved through it, adapted within it, and emerged intact on the other side. After Tarawa, nothing in the Pacific looked the same. And as word of the island spread through surviving units, one realization took hold with unsettling clarity. This enemy was not becoming weaker with each battle. He was becoming something far more dangerous. In the months following Tarawa, Japanese after-action reports began to read differently. Where earlier documents focused on enemy numbers and equipment, newer assessments emphasized behavior. American units were not merely repeating successful tactics, they were refining them. Each engagement revealed fewer errors, faster responses, and a growing ability to operate under pressure without hesitation. Performance was not plateauing, it was accelerating. This pattern unsettled Japanese comm. And as more than raw losses. Attrition had always been understood as a mutual process. Prolonged fighting would erode morale, discipline, and effectiveness on both sides. But the Marines did not erode as expected. They absorbed experience and converted it into capability with unsettling efficiency. Lessons learned on one island reappeared, fully formed on the next. What compounded this realization was the quality of American reinforcements. Fresh units arriving in the Pacific did not behave like untested replacements. They landed disciplined, aggressive, and already aligned with the tempo of combat. Training pipelines had adjusted. Veterans were rotated into instruction roles. Institutional knowledge flowed forward rather than dissipating. The force did not dilute, it renewed itself. Japanese commanders recognized the implication too late. They were not fighting a static enemy, but a learning organism. Each Marine regiment represented not only manpower, but memory. Tactics refined through blood were now standard practice. Mistakes that once cost lives were no longer repeated. Adaptation outpaced destruction. Morale responded accordingly. Confidence, once vocal and unquestioned, withdrew into silence. Orders remained firm, but belief softened beneath them. Soldiers noticed how quickly American units reorganized after contact, how rapidly fire followed movement, how seldom opportunities appeared, and how swiftly they vanished when taken. The myth of American softness did not collapse dramatically, it dissolved. There was no single moment of reversal, only a steady accumulation of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Marines were not hesitant, they were deliberate. They did not rely solely on firepower, they applied it intelligently, and they did not lose cohesion under strain. This realization introduced a new emotional weight. Fear shifted from anticipation of attack to expectation of inevitability. Engagements were no longer approached as opportunities for decisive action, but as delaying efforts against a force that would adjust regardless of outcome. Even success felt temporary. Marine strength, once dismissed as situational, became a constant. It no longer depended on terrain, timing, or surprise. It was present at the outset of each battle and persisted through its conclusion. Japanese planners found themselves preparing not for victory, but for resistance against a superior learning curve. The psychological balance had inverted. The Marines were no longer reacting to Japanese initiative. They were setting the terms of engagement. Pressure flowed in one direction. Time favored one side. As attention shifted northward toward the Marianas, this understanding followed. Saipan was marked not simply as another objective, but as a test of whether anything could still halt this momentum. Japanese defenses were strengthened, doctrine was reaffirmed, faith was summoned where confidence had once resided. But beneath the preparations lay an unspoken awareness. The Americans arriving on Saipan would not be the same Marines faced months earlier. They would be more experienced, more integrated, and far less likely to be surprised. On Saipan, that realization would no longer remain theoretical. Saipan rose sharply from the sea, its ridgelines broken by ravines, cane fields, and volcanic rock that turned every advance into a calculated negotiation with terrain. When the Marines came ashore in June 1944, they encountered defenses prepared with care and expectation. Japanese commanders believed that depth, counterattack, and sacrifice could still impose decision. What unfolded instead was the systematic erosion of doctrine itself. Marines maneuvered with a flexibility that defied prediction. Units advanced in staggered bounds, shifting direction as resistance revealed itself. Terrain that once favored static defense became a liability as fire teams flanked through gullies and across slopes assumed impassable. Movement was deliberate, rarely hurried, and almost never disorganized. Where resistance stiffened, pressure accumulated rather than surged. Japanese counterattacks followed established pattern. They were launched with resolve and coordination, often at night or dawn, designed to fracture Marine lines through shock. But the lines no longer fractured. Fire discipline held, machine guns interlocked. Rifles engaged targets as they appeared, not as doctrine prescribed. Counterattacks collapsed under measured response, leaving ground unchanged and casualties unrecovered. For the first time in the Pacific, civilians were present in large numbers, and their presence introduced an unexpected witness. Japanese propaganda had promised savagery and indiscriminate violence. What many civilians observed instead was restraint, fire withheld when possible, prisoners processed rather than executed, medical aid rendered in the midst of chaos. These moments did not soften the battle, but they complicated its meaning. Within Japanese ranks, perception continued to shift. Diaries and letters began to describe the enemy with new language. Marines were no longer caricatured as reckless or mechanical. They were called unyielding, methodical, words that acknowledged not just strength, but control. Respect emerged reluctantly, bound tightly to fear. This psychological evolution mattered. Fear alone could be endured. Respect altered calculation. Marines were no longer seen as obstacles to be overcome through sacrifice, but as a force that adapted faster than doctrine could respond. Every attempted solution seemed already anticipated. Every adjustment met a counter-adjustment. Marine improvement had become constant. Fire coordination tightened. Armor and infantry moved with practiced timing. Artillery support responded with precision rather than volume. The battlefield felt less chaotic to those directing it and more suffocating to those resisting it. Japanese commanders faced an opponent whose effectiveness no longer depended on surprise or circumstance. By the time organized resistance collapsed, the outcome felt less like defeat than confirmation. Saipan did not introduce a new reality, it reinforced an existing one. The Marines were not merely advancing geographically, they were advancing institutionally, refining an approach that Japan could neither replicate nor disrupt. The fall of Saipan carried strategic consequences, but its psychological impact traveled farther. Survivors carried their observations to other garrisons, other islands, other defensive plans. What had once been dismissed as rumor now carried the weight of experience. Across the Pacific, a reputation began to move ahead of the Marines, quietly, persistently, and with growing authority. Soon, the enemy would no longer wait to discover what kind of force was landing. They would already know. By mid-1944, the Marines no longer arrived as an unknown quantity. Their reputation preceded them, carried not by propaganda or official communiques, but by survivors. Japanese units rotating out of shattered garrisons spoke quietly, with an authority earned under fire. The message was consistent. These Americans could not be intimidated. Shock failed, pressure failed, even prolonged losses failed to produce collapse. The stories spread laterally, from regiment to regiment, often stripped of exaggeration. Marines were described as calm under fire, aggressive when opportunity appeared, and patient when it did not. They did not rush blindly, nor did they retreat impulsively. They waited. Then they moved. For soldiers trained to believe fear could be induced and exploited, this behavior was profoundly destabilizing. Rumors followed, some grounded in experience, others shaped by anxiety. Marines were said to prefer close combat, to advance deliberately into killing zones rather than avoid them. The claim was not literal, but it carried psychological weight. It suggested an enemy unafraid of proximity, one who trusted discipline and coordination more than distance or concealment. The battlefield, already shrinking, felt smaller still. This reputation exacted a cost on established Japanese tactics. Banzai charges, once regarded as decisive expressions of will, began to fail catastrophically. Against marine fire discipline, massed assaults became predictable trajectories rather than moments of shock. Machine guns locked lanes, riflemen engaged targets individually, artillery responded with calculated timing. Courage met preparation, and preparation prevailed. The effect was cumulative. Japanese troops began to modify behavior not from confidence, but from apprehension. Attacks were delayed, fragmented, or abandoned entirely. Defensive positions were reinforced deeper, then deeper still. Movement became cautious. Initiative narrowed. Fear reshaped decision-making before the enemy ever appeared. Language reflected the change. In field conversations and written reports, Marines ceased to function as a generic descriptor. It became shorthand for an elite American fighter, distinct from other U.S. units, associated with a specific kind of threat. To face Marines was to expect persistence, precision, and refusal to disengage. This shift marked a decisive psychological turning point. Momentum no longer belonged to the attacker by default. It belonged to the side whose reputation imposed restraint on the other. Marines did not need to demonstrate superiority repeatedly. Belief now carried part of the burden. Anticipation altered outcomes before contact. Yet reputation alone could not win battles. It had to survive new conditions, harsher terrain, and enemies prepared specifically to counter it. Japanese planners selected ground where marine advantages might be neutralized: narrow ridges, fortified caves, heat beyond endurance. If there was a place where legend could be tested, it would be there. That place was Peleliu. The island was small, sun-blasted, and engineered for defense. Caves honeycombed its ridges. Fields of fire overlapped with mathematical precision. Japanese command believed endurance could still prevail where shock had failed. They believed that if the Marines were to be stopped anywhere, it would be here. As the war reached Peleliu, reputation crossed a threshold. It would no longer be enough to inspire caution or dread. It would have to endure its most punishing examination yet. Peleliu offered no illusions. The heat arrived first, pressing down with a weight that drained strength before the enemy was even encountered. Temperatures climbed past endurance, water grew scarce, and the coral ground reflected sunlight upward like a furnace. Above it all rose ridges hollowed by caves, defensive positions carved not for spectacle, but for survival. Japanese planners believed the island itself would exhaust the attacker before resistance ever needed to. When the Marines landed in September 1944, they entered a battle designed to be endured rather than won. The enemy did not rush forward. He waited. Fire came from hidden apertures, from slopes that appeared lifeless until they erupted. Progress was measured not in yards, but in meters reclaimed and held under constant observation. Each advance exposed another layer of resistance. Marine units thinned rapidly. Casualties mounted day after day, not in dramatic surges, but in a steady, grinding subtraction. Heatstroke collapsed men alongside bullet wounds, yet cohesion remained. Companies fought at reduced strength without losing structure. Command passed seamlessly as officers fell. Orders were shorter, movements slower, resolve unchanged. Japanese defenders watched with growing disbelief. They had expected the Americans to rely on momentum, to falter once attrition erased numerical advantage. Instead, the Marines matched endurance with endurance. They did not withdraw when losses mounted. They adjusted posture, redistributed fire, and continued forward. What had been calculated as an American weakness revealed itself as parity. Close combat intensified the psychological weight. Caves had to be cleared manually, flamethrowers, demolition charges, rifles fired into darkness at arm's length. Each position taken revealed another behind it. The fighting erased distance and compressed time. Marines learned to listen for breathing, for movement behind stone. Survival depended on calm precision in spaces where panic would have been fatal. Under these conditions, innovation emerged instinctively. Small units improvised techniques without waiting for instruction, sealing caves rather than clearing them, coordinating fire by gesture and instinct, rotating assault elements to conserve strength. Doctrine bent to necessity. Necessity shaped practice. The Marines' ability to adapt did not pause under pressure, it accelerated. Japanese diaries captured the shift in perception. The language was restrained but unmistakable. The Americans were described as tireless, persistent, unrelenting, not reckless, not chaotic. Their willingness to continue, even when conditions favored no one, unsettled defend. RS, who had expected endurance to be their exclusive domain. Peleliu did not yield quickly. It consumed time, men, and certainty on both sides. When organized resistance finally collapsed, the cost was staggering. Marine units emerged depleted, scarred, and altered. Victory carried no triumph. It arrived as relief that survival had finally outpaced resistance. For Japanese command, the lesson cut deeper than defeat. The Marines had not merely survived an environment designed to destroy them. They had functioned within it, learning, adjusting, and applying pressure until the defense failed. Endurance was no longer a comparative advantage. It was shared, and where endurance was equal, adaptation decided outcome. The legend that preceded the Marines did not diminish at Peleliu. It hardened. It acquired texture and credibility drawn from suffering rather than success. Fear gave way to a quieter conclusion. This enemy could not be exhausted into submission. As the war pressed northward, Japanese planners searched for terrain where even this resilience might be broken. One island remained, smaller, colder, and fortified with a depth unseen before. Its volcanic sand and sulfurous air would offer no concealment, no relief, and no retreat. Its name was Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was never meant to be subtle. From the outset, Japanese command anticipated staggering American losses, and they planned accordingly. The island's defenses were not arranged for spectacle or immediate repulsion, but for endurance. Hundreds of interconnected tunnels, deep concrete bunkers, and artillery positions buried beneath volcanic rock transformed the terrain into a single, unified weapon. If the Marines were to take Iwo Jima, it would be at a cost that could not be ignored. When the landings began in February 1945, the prediction proved correct. Casualties came quickly and continuously. Volcanic sand swallowed movement, offering no cover and no stability. Fire erupted not from visible lines, but from unseen apertures that revealed themselves only when Marines were already exposed. Entire units stalled within minutes of reaching shore. Losses accumulated with a grim predictability. Yet the advance did not halt. Day after day, Marines moved forward in measured increments, sometimes yards, sometimes less. Progress was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was constant. Positions taken were held. Ground lost was retaken. Momentum did not surge, it persisted. Even as battalions were reduced and companies hollowed, cohesion remained intact. The tunnel systems that defined Iwo Jima demanded a new form of combat. The enemy could disappear and reappear behind advancing lines. Positions cleared once could become lethal again within hours. Overcoming this required more than courage. Marines developed techniques under fire, sealing tunnels, coordinating flamethrowers with demolition teams, adjusting fire patterns to deny reoccupation. Grit alone was insufficient. Persistence had to be paired with method. For Japanese defenders, the psychological impact deepened with each passing day. They had expected American losses to translate into hesitation, perhaps withdrawal. Instead, casualties were absorbed without visible effect on resolve. Units reformed. Attacks resumed. The rhythm of advance continued, indifferent to cost. What was intended as a war of attrition became a test of will, and the result was not as calculated. The flag raised atop Mount Suribachi came midway through the battle, not at its conclusion. It did not signal victory. Fighting continued across the island for weeks afterward, but the image endured because it captured something essential. It represented resolve under pressure, endurance without certainty, determination expressed not through triumph, but through continuation. Japanese leadership watching the battle unfold reached a sobering conclusion. The Marines could be wounded, delayed, and exhausted, but not stopped. Defensive depth extended the fight, but it did not alter its trajectory. Every measure imposed cost. None imposed surrender. The Americans advanced not because the path was clear, but because retreat was never accepted as an option. By the time organized resistance collapsed, Iwo Jima lay devastated. The island had fulfilled its purpose tactically, inflicting heavy casualties and consuming time. Strategically and psychologically, however, it confirmed what earlier battles had already suggested. This enemy did not break under pressure proportional to loss. He adjusted, endured, and continued. For Japan, the realization was unavoidable. There were no remaining islands where terrain alone could compensate for this imbalance. No configuration of defenses that could reliably exhaust such determination. What remained was not a question of whether the Marines could be stopped, but how much destruction would accompany the attempt. As the war moved toward its final phase, the consequences of that realization began to shape decisions far beyond the battlefield. The fighting on Iwo Jima did not merely secure an island. It clarified the cost of continuing a war against an unyielding foe. By the spring of 1945, Okinawa was approached without illusion. Japanese commanders no longer debated the character of the enemy they faced. The Marines' reputation was fully formed, no longer rumor, no longer hypothesis, but a conclusion drawn from years of defeat and observation. What remained was not hope of reversal, but calculation of cost. Direct assaults against Marine positions were now understood as fatal gestures. Experience had stripped away earlier confidence in shock and sacrifice. Japanese units had seen too many attacks dissolve under disciplined fire, too many formations reduced before momentum could take hold. On Okinawa, resistance was reorganized around delay rather than decision, endurance rather than victory. The battle unfolded as the largest and most complex ground engagement of the Pacific War. Rain turned terrain into mud. Artillery reshaped hillsides. Defensive lines receded slowly, deliberately, trading space for time. Marines advanced through a landscape engineered to exhaust both body and will, yet the rhythm established on earlier islands held. Pressure accumulated. Positions fell. The advance continued. Where Japanese initiative remained, it took a different form. Kamikaze attacks surged offshore, aimed not at defeating Marines directly, but at disrupting the machinery that supported them. These strikes reflected desperation rather than strategy, a recognition that conventional means had failed to impose psychological collapse. Sacrifice was redirected skyward because it could no longer function effectively on land. On the ground, Marines combined what the war had taught them. Firepower was applied methodically, not extravagantly. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air support moved in practiced coordination. When resistance stiffened, adaptation followed. When conditions worsened, discipline absorbed the strain. Mental resilience, shaped by years of attrition, proved as decisive as material advantage. Japanese officers observing the campaign reached conclusions once unthinkable. In reports and private reflections, they acknowledged that American discipline now equaled their own. The admission carried weight. It marked the collapse of a foundational assumption that moral superiority could compensate for material imbalance. On Okinawa, parity of endurance met superiority of adaptation. Fear did not disappear, it transformed. It lost its edge and gained clarity. Marines were no longer regarded as unpredictable or monstrous. They were recognized as professional, persistent, and relentless in pursuit of objective. The enemy was no longer misunderstood. He was understood completely, and therein lay the final gravity of the realization. Okinawa did not break Japanese resistance outright, but it completed the psychological arc that had begun years earlier on distant, lesser-known islands. The Marines had proven that no environment, no tactic, and no level of sacrifice could reliably compel them to yield. What had once been feared became accepted. What had been denied became acknowledged. For the Marines themselves, Okinawa reinforced identity. They were no longer becoming something, they had become it. The habits forged through Guadalcanal, refined through Tarawa, hardened at Peleliu, and proven at Iwo Jima now defined the core. Resolve was no longer situational, it was institutional. As the battle drew to its bloody conclusion, attention began to shift beyond the immediate horizon of war. Defeat was approaching, but understanding arrived first. Japanese leaders would soon analyze not just how they had lost, but why the enemy they faced had been so difficult to break. The answers would not be found in weapons alone. They would be written in memory, reflection, and the quiet reassessment of assumptions once held with certainty. When the war ended, silence replaced urgency. Weapons were set aside, commands dissolved, and the immediacy of survival gave way to reflection. It was in this space, after defeat, after loss, that Japanese soldiers and officers began to write with a candor impossible during war. Diaries, memoirs, and interviews recorded not justification, but assessment. And within those pages, the Marines appeared again, not as enemies to be resisted, but as forces to be understood. Many accounts return to the same observation: endurance. Marines were described as soldiers who did not retreat when logic suggested withdrawal, who continued to function when conditions stripped away advantage. The tone was not celebratory, but precise. Respect emerged not from admiration, but from recognition. These Americans had not relied on recklessness or excess. They had relied on cohesion. Japanese strategists, studying the Pacific campaigns, searched for explanations beyond material superiority. Firepower alone could not account for what they had witnessed. Nor could numbers. The conclusion repeated itself across analyses. The Marines adapted faster than the battlefield could punish them. They learned in contact. They corrected failure immediately. And once learned, those corrections became permanent. This forced a reckoning with pre-war assumptions. The belief that American soldiers were comfort-dependent, unwilling to endure hardship, and psychologically fragile was exposed as illusion. It had been a projection shaped by cultural distance rather than evidence. The Marines encountered in the Pacific did not fight as representatives of indulgence, but as practitioners of discipline. Post-war military studies within Japan increasingly emphasized adaptability as the decisive Marine trait. Decentralized leadership, empowered non-commissioned officers, and a culture that rewarded initiative were identified as critical advantages. These were not traits that could be neutralized through sacrifice alone. They required an opponent capable of matching flexibility with flexibility, a condition Japan had not been structured to meet. Cultural misreadings became cautionary lessons. Analysts noted how assumptions about national character had distorted strategy, encouraging reliance on shock where resilience was required. The Marines had not won simply by enduring longer. They had won by changing faster. That distinction mattered. It reframed the Pacific War as a contest not just of will, but of institutional learning. Within the Marine Corps, these post-war reflections contributed to an emerging identity. The legend was not built on triumph alone, but on acknowledgement from those who had faced it directly. Respect carried a different weight than fear. It suggested that what had been demonstrated in war could be sustained in peace, as doctrine, as memory, as expectation. Over time, the Marine image hardened into symbol, not invincible, not flawless, but defined by a refusal to disintegrate under pressure. The Pacific campaigns became reference points, not for victory counts, but for conduct under extremes. The Corps remembered itself as others had seen it. Yet memory does more than preserve reputation. It offers warning. The Japanese reflections did not merely honor an adversary, they illuminated the danger of misunderstanding an enemy's capacity for endurance and change. War punished misreading with finality. As historians turned from battles to meaning, the story of the Marines in the Pacific assumed its final shape. It was no longer simply about who prevailed. It became a study in resolve, how it is formed, how it is tested, and how it is recognized only after belief has been stripped away. And in that recognition lay the war's quietest and most enduring lesson. Wars are often remembered through their instruments: ships launched, weapons refined, tonnage expended. Yet beneath those measurements lies a quieter determinant, one less visible but no less decisive. The Pacific War revealed, island by island, that outcomes were shaped not only by what armies possessed, but by what they believed, and how long those beliefs could survive pressure. Japanese soldiers entered the conflict with a conviction deeply rooted in culture and training, that endurance and willingness to die conferred moral and psychological superiority. It was an ethic forged over generations, reinforced through doctrine, and validated by earlier victories. What they encountered in the Pacific unsettled that certainty. The Marines they faced did not mirror Japanese endurance, they matched it. And where endurance reached its limit, they surpassed it through adaptation. This realization carried weight precisely because it was gradual. Fear did not emerge from spectacle or cruelty. It was not born of sudden terror. It grew from repetition, from watching lines hold when they should have folded, from seeing units reorganize after losses that would have ended resistance elsewhere, from discovering that pressure produced refinement rather than collapse. Each island repeated the lesson with minor variation. Guadalcanal revealed resistance. Tarawa demonstrated persistence under catastrophic loss. Peleliu proved endurance could be shared. Iwo Jima confirmed that even overwhelming cost could not compel surrender. Okinawa completed the arc, leaving no remaining space for doubt. Marines did not break, not because they were immune to fear, but because fear did not govern their decisions. The Pacific War thus became a study in psychological reversal. The side that expected to dominate through shock found itself constrained by anticipation. The side assumed to lack stamina revealed a capacity for sustained effort that reshaped every engagement. Belief shifted direction, initiative followed. For Japanese soldiers, this shift was not abstract. It altered how they moved, how they planned, and how they remembered. Fear became respect, not as concession, but as acknowledgement. The Marines were not invulnerable. They suffered, bled, and died in enormous numbers, but they absorbed those losses without surrendering cohesion or purpose. That distinction defined the war's final understanding. In post-war reflection, this recognition endured. Strategists analyzed structures. Historians examined culture. Veterans recalled moments of disbelief when attacks failed not because they lacked courage, but because the enemy refused to unravel. What emerged was not a myth of invincibility, but a clearer view of resolve as an institutional force, cultivated deliberately, sustained collectively, and applied consistently. Resolve, the war revealed, is not loud. It does not announce itself in advance. It is visible only in repetition, when expectation and outcome diverge again and again. The Marines did not rely on a single defining moment. They imposed a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, are impossible to ignore. This is why the Pacific campaigns still resonate beyond their strategic outcomes. They remind us that the most decisive elements of war are often intangible: belief, adaptability, and the refusal to yield when surrender seems reasonable. Weapons may shape battlefields, but will shape wars. And in the end, that was the lesson learned across the Pacific, written quietly into memory by those who faced it firsthand. This is why Japanese soldiers learned to fear US Marines, because on every island they found a force more relentless than the war itself.